Hi, thanks for listening to our sermon podcast, Second on the Mount. I'm George Anderson, minister at Second Presbyterian in Roanoke, Virginia. I do not take it for granted that people sit in the pews on Sunday morning or listen to these podcasts hoping to hear something that connects them to God, to each other, to the world. And so I spend hours seeking the right word for the right time and said in the right way. I welcome your feedback. I encourage your sharing this sermon with anyone it might benefit, and I hope you'll return to this podcast again or come visit us for worship. We'd be happy to have you.
Today is Pentecost Sunday. The passage that is so often read on Pentecost Sunday is the passage that tells of a Jewish festival giving birth to the Christian church. I've preached on this passage from Acts 2 so many times. You know, the passage that tells of the tongues of fire and people from other places hearing the gospel in their own language, this mass revival where in a day thousands come to the cause of Christ, thousands come to this cause of the one who was crucified just a few days earlier. Preached on it so many times. I was going to change it up and avoid that passage this year and focus on Paul's reflections on the Holy Spirit out of Romans 8. My effort was in vain. I kept being pulled back to what happened that day in Jerusalem, so I gave up. Before hearing the invited keynote speaker out of Romans 8, let's listen to the uninvited protester have his say. Acts 2, 1 through 13. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly, from heaven, there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind. And it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as a fire appeared upon them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native tongue of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea," and he goes on. There are other nationalities, some of which have a hard time pronouncing, so I'm going to skip over that. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." The word of the Lord. And then Acts 2 goes on to describe how Peter then preaches a sermon to this diverse international audience. And somehow his sermon cuts through language and cultural barriers, and people of many lands hear and believe that the one who was crucified was raised to lead a movement. And get this, it's going to sound crazy. Raised to lead a movement not of revenge and takeover, but of forgiveness and reconciliation. And that so many people hear this and believe it, that's the miracle. Well, not all who here believe. There are those who are too committed into believing that something like this could never happen. They stand off to the side and give their spin. What a bunch of drunks. For now, though, let's us stand off from the standoff critics. Let's celebrate what's described in Acts 2. This passage honors, I think, events like the dedication day of Alexa House, when a diverse community became one because a message of grace spoke to everyone that was there. Responding to three unrelated tragedies and responding to a common cause, people of different churches, people of different faiths, people of different races, believers and unbelievers, met at this graceful point last Sunday night. And it was a point that had been a long time coming, a point to which fundraising and renovation and design work and celebration planning came together on a Mother's Day, but on a moment, cultural differences. It's as if new languages were spoken and we all heard the same message of grace. It honors that day of Pentecost. Now, that's unlike our passage from Romans, which also speaks about the Holy Spirit, but this passage is about waiting. It's even about the Spirit waiting with us, waiting for a moment like that to come. Paul speaks more to the prayers of those who are asking for the Spirit to come, especially those in pain, especially those who mourn. It's the waiting for answers when life seems senseless, waiting for healing when the heart is wounded, waiting to understand when the path forward does not seem clear. And in the case of Alexa House, that time of waiting for those different lines to come together, the need for Family Promise to build a facility, the demand of a fire marshal for safety, the lines of responding to three different tragedies that were hard to turn away from, all those lines to come together to a day when a house can be dedicated and a ribbon cut at the site of a future playground. It's the kind of waiting that is necessary. And it's the kind of waiting that happened with these followers of Jesus before the day of Pentecost. Waiting, praying for it to come, but waiting because it won't come on demand. It's the waiting that happens in the world where those things that divide us continue to define us. We wait for the day to come when the Spirit can puncture holes in the walls that divide us, so that maybe our shared humanity can be revealed, our shared responsibility in the sin that divides us be confessed together, our shared need for grace exposed, and our shared need to love even strangers, to love even enemies, become real, because it's love that's going to heal us. Here's what the Apostle Paul says. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we are saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what one already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with its own groanings, too deep for words. And God, who searches hearts, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Again, the word of the Lord. Two passages about the Holy Spirit saying different things, almost in tension with each other. Let's go back to the passage that talks of Pentecost in Acts 2. Many describe the day of Pentecost as being the church's special day. It's happy birthday day. That's a good way to think of it. But for today, anyway, I'd like to think of it differently, because I'm not sure that in light of what I want to say, that the Christian church was birthed on this particular day, because in the days prior, the followers of Jesus were doing all those things that you do in church. They were worshiping together. They were studying together. They were having fellowship together. They were serving those in need. They were just doing it while hiding. They were doing it in private. So maybe it would be better to say that Pentecost was a bar mitzvah day, a coming of age day, when a young church hiding in private suddenly becomes public. That's what I see described in Acts. Followers of Jesus are confused and they're frightened and they stay in. They are hiding from them. They are set apart from those who are not them, those who may even be out to get them. And their fears seem justified, doesn't it? Because what happened to Jesus could happen to them. Also, they're saying that Jesus who died was raised, that this Jesus appeared to them, who's now at loose in the world. Well, that does sound like something that people who are drunk would say. But on this day, though, after this long waiting, after this waiting for lions together to come together, something happens, something is ignited, something private becomes public. Fear turns to fervor, and now Jews from around the world, many of whom might have heard about Jesus, but few of whom would have known Jesus personally, they get as excited about Jesus as those who emerge into view, speaking of him in a way that they can understand. Speaking to them as if their very different lives, as if their lives are being addressed. So while the church may have been growing up before this day, on Pentecost it emerges with adult responsibilities in the world. Yes, a bar mitzvah day for the church, an ordination and commissioning day. As a community, it moves from childlike self-protection against them to joining with them as a family of faith. Notice that it's the church that appears that you can point to that day. What does not appear that you could point to is what ignited the church and brought them into public. You cannot point to the Holy Spirit, and you cannot schedule a day for the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit keeps its own calendar. Notice that in the description of Pentecost that words like fire and spirit are used, things that you can't see, but you see the effects of them at work. I remember having a conversation with Heather Teams, a visual artist who is Kathy Cannon's sister. Heather was working on 4 pieces that would represent the 4 essential elements of life: earth, water, air, and fire. And she was having a difficult time thinking of a way to portray air. How can you portray something that you cannot see? Well, her solution, which you can find on Facebook, I'll put a link in the sermon, her solution was not to depict air, but to depict what happens when air moves as wind. It depicts a dandelion, the pappus or fluff, tugging against and breaking free from their stem. Well, that picture that she painted could well be cover art for a sermon based on John 3:8, which says this about the Spirit and talking about the wind. The wind's going to blow where it chooses. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it goes from or where it goes. The Spirit keeps its own schedule. It does not arrive on demand. I don't know what to say to you about speaking in tongues, which many Pentecostalists and other charismatic Christians seem to be able to do on demand. I'm not judging the authenticity of their worship. I'm only sticking to the biblical narratives when the Spirit will not be at our beck and call, but needs to be prayed for, waited for. The Spirit which will even be with us in our waiting, Paul says, praying with us, groaning with us, wanting to come what needs to come when the Spirit will finally act like a rushing wind. Those are the biblical narratives. I'll give a quick review. In the creation stories, the face of the deep was void and lifeless. It was the Spirit of God that separates water from land and brings teeming life to the sea and to the land. When the Spirit calls on Elijah, He assumes it's someone else in the house that's calling him. He was not expecting the Spirit to come and call him to the life of a prophet. When Isaiah enters the temple on a day to worship, he does not suddenly expect that the whole place is going to be filled with the presence of God, and he is to leave his comfortable life and be a prophet who says the hard truth when no one wants to hear it, and then the glad truth when most everyone believes it's too good to be true. And in Mark's gospel, the Spirit isn't called upon, but shows up as a surprise guest at Jesus' baptism. And then it's the Spirit who immediately drives Jesus out into the wilderness for 40 days of testing in preparation for his ministry. And then on Pentecost, the followers of Jesus have no idea that the Spirit is going to pay them a visit that day and make them loud and vocal about Jesus being raised. Nor did the pilgrims from around the world who were in Jerusalem expect their Pentecost celebration to call them into a movement that gathers around this crucified and risen Lord. They just came for the festival. Those visits of the Spirit are unscheduled and unexpected moments. That's what Paul is talking about in chapters 8 of Romans. We wait, and the whole creation waits with us. We groan because there's so much that divides us. We want something to break through. We want something to expose our common humanity and to bring the peace and reconciliation that we've been praying for in the world. But it's important we know and remember what it is that we're praying for and waiting on, so we might then recognize that it's happening and not just call them a bunch of drunks. It's good that we remember what happened with Isaiah and with Jesus and with the disciples at Pentecost, with Saul when he became Paul, with Peter when he had this dream about eating food that was not kosher. Before the Spirit could become the rushing wind, lines had to converge. There had to be this long, slow, gentle breezes of the Spirit that work within relationships and within circumstances of life to bring about what is so hard to bring about. And this is what is so hard to bring about. In so many of these instances, and certainly at Pentecost, to bring about people who are different and who define themselves apart from each other, suddenly to have those differences stripped away, and to see that we all commonly need the grace that the disciples are preaching about. That's what the great movements of the Spirit are so often about when you read the Bible. It's certainly what this Pentecost story is about. It's also, I think, what so many personal visions, when the Holy Spirit rushes like the mighty wind into individual lives, is about. Because there are personal experiences of this common story that we are reading, and they're not arbitrary. It's about opening our eyes to the neighbor and the brother and sister who is right there in front of us. When Peter Enns was here, he talked about one of those kinds of experiences. He told of being in a car in San Francisco on his way to a lecture. And that day the streets were crowded. There were people everywhere. Looking around, he saw this array of people getting in the way, crossing the street, waiting for lights. He had to get to this lecture. They were of all nationalities, of income, of sexual orientation, people just of all types in view. Most of these people were dressed for work and for play, but there were also some who were dressed in garb that set them apart for their religion. And for him, all of a sudden, in a moment, everything looked different. And looking around, it suddenly realized that all of these people that were around him were connected to him and were in their own way just like him. Every single one of them, children of God, and every single one of them, and he didn't know a single name, brothers and sisters in a real way. It was not like he had some new intellectual truth, because he knew that all along. It was just a revelation of what was true in a way he could not realize it before. There was nothing really that separated him from any of those who were walking the streets that day. And Enns says for him, it was a real day of new beginning for him. He was a Bible scholar, and for him, so much of his scholarship, so much of his thought was was about what divides us, about what we have to do to set ourselves apart. And in that day, suddenly he realizes the real project of his life had to be about bringing those people together. There are people in this congregation who've told me of having similar kinds of visions. I won't call them out. I'll tell you about one that I had. I was studying at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College. I was a philosophy major and a drama major, but I was a philosophy major because I was trying to understand. I was trying to figure things out. I was trying to get answers. And on a hard day of study, I had to take a break. I walked around the lake at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College. And on this moment, all of a sudden in a moment, looking at the lake, looking at the world around me, it all looked very different. And I could boil it down to this because this was the single revelation I had that day. This was not a world that I was called to understand. It was a world I was called to love. And then I began thinking about maybe ways that I could serve by loving rather than understanding. Y'all, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm a mainline Christian. I'm not really comfortable talking about those kinds of visions and experiences. I am very aware that when people like me talk like that there are those who might have the very logical reaction of those standing at the edge of Pentecost saying, well, that's crazy. Or they must be drunk. But here's the point that I want to make to you is you need to understand that nothing looks different on any of those days. Nothing that is visible changes. The only thing that changes is unseen. I don't think people who would have seen the same street scene would understand why Peter Enns would have to collect himself and get his mind back on the lecture he needed to give that he was in no mood to give that day. I don't think people would have understood why I needed to sit down and take a moment and think about things at the edge of that lake. And I don't think that people at the day of Pentecost, that there's some at the day of Pentecost would have seen anything all that radically different except this group of people doing what often happens in the streets of big cities, having this celebratory, this moment, this experience where folks have come together and get excited about something. Nothing changes. That's seen. You can only see the effects of the Holy Spirit in what it causes. And here we don't have to get lost in what the God told me this or God showed me that. Not in the realm of what we're talking about today. It's always about this, or at least it was about this on the day of Pentecost. That the person that's sitting beside you in the pew right now, and the people you least understand out there, and all those people that are being defined to you constantly in our world today as being different, that we might even can dismiss or demonize. Every single one of them is connected to you. Is no different from you. That we're all children of God who need to know that we need the same grace that they do, and our hope is the same as theirs. I wanted to tell one final story. It's fictional, but it's really not. Abraham Verghese wrote it in his novel, The Covenant of Water, but I have learned that it is but a retelling of something that he went through. He told of Dr. Rune Orkvist, a Swedish doctor, living a happy, fulfilling life serving people in India. His life is good. Nothing he feels needs to change. He has good friends. He has many interests outside of his work as a doctor. He lacks nothing. So he's not prepared at all for what happens one night. He is sitting on a bench after a late night of work, looking out over the sea as he sometimes does, smoking one last pipe to wind down before heading to bed. He's content. And he hears the shuffling sound of a beggar approaching him. Even in moonlight, he recognizes that this is a leper. This is the 1920s, so Dr. Roon would be comfortable using that term and not calling it something like Hansen's disease. This leper stumbles along on his stumps, a cup tied around his neck where those so moved can place a coin. And then Dr. Roon has this moment. He's always been a man to have empathy for someone like that, to have empathy for someone who had this disease, who had to deal with leprosy. But this moment is different because in this moment, he sees himself. In a dizzying shift of perspective, Roon suddenly feels he has become the leper. It is Roon who sees cloudy, smeared images with no edges. Roon who discerns light and shadows, but remember what it's like to have moonlight fall on his face. Those are Roon's misshapen, ulcerated feet wrapped with bloodied sack and secured with rope. And remarkably, the difference between him and the leper is no difference at all. And his life changes. He closes his successful practice to go to a colony of lepers to live there. Of course, he serves them as a doctor. That's his profession. But he goes there because he wants to live with his people. That's the epiphany of Pentecost. All these differences, which mean so much, erased. And everyone standing there in bare, naked need of God's grace, giving us only one option, and that is to love.
Second Presbyterian, finding direction by following Jesus.